He was just crying until someone finally saw him. Have you ever heard a sound of pure grief that shatters you from the inside without needing any words? It wasn't a bark or a howl. It was something else entirely. A low, muted sound, like a sigh dragged up from the absolute bottom of a broken heart. It was the kind of cry you don't hear with your ears, but with your chest. A sound that makes you stop, turn, even if you don't know why. That was the sound drifting every afternoon from a narrow alley between two crumbling walls, behind a cracked wooden fence where almost no one ever passed, except for old Mr. Frank. Frank wasn't anyone special, just an elderly man with slow steps, a heavy wooden cane, and a worn baseball cap he always wore tilted to the side.
No, I don't want to do this.
He'd lived alone in his simple row house since his wife, Martha, passed away years ago. His routine was fixed. Strong black coffee, a bagel, and sitting by the front window to watch the street like a silent movie. But that afternoon, something shifted. When he walked past the faded adobe wall, he heard that sound for the very first time. He stopped dead. He blinked, frowned. It was my imagination. That's what it was, he muttered to himself. He edged closer. Not much, just a few steps. And then he heard it again, clearer this time. A long, painful, living whimper. Through a gap in the wall, he could just glimpse a patch of dirt and shadow, and there he saw him. It was a small dog tied with a short, frayed rope to a rusty metal grate. His ears drooped, and his body hunched as if trying to shrink out of existence. His eyes were huge, far too large for his starved, thin face, and from one of them, a slow tear tracked down, as if his soul was weeping without permission. He was filthy, not dirty like a dog who's been playing in the park. No, he was coated in old grime, his matted fur glued down by dust and hunger. His ribs pressed against his skin like the bars of an invisible cage, and he didn't bark. He didn't move. He only cried. Frank felt a crushing tightness in his chest. What in the hell is going on here? The image was so raw that for a moment, he forgot where he was. Something inside him, something old and long dormant, flared to life. He didn't know who the owner was. He didn't know how long the dog had been there, but he knew one thing for certain. This was wrong. He moved closer, but the dog, seeing his shape, simply dropped his head. He didn't growl. He didn't try to run. He didn't even attempt to defend himself. Because when an animal has been abused for so long, not even fear is left, only silence. Frank backed up, looking around. Nobody, just the dry afternoon heat and the distant sound of a semi-truck. "This can't stay this way," he whispered, his voice catching. And just like that, without knowing it, a story began that would change the life of that small dog. And Mr. Frank's, too. Because once someone finally sees, they can't look away. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He got out of bed several times, peered through the blinds, sat, stood, paced in circles as if something was burning inside him. The image of the small dog, huddled there with eyes full of sorrow, wouldn't leave him alone. Something was stirring deep within. It wasn't just pity. It was a mix of helplessness, anger, and that desperate urgency that sometimes arises in the soul when you know something is broken but haven't figured out how to fix it yet. The next morning, at 7 a.m. sharp, Frank returned to the same spot. This time, he carried a turkey and Swiss sandwich and a small bottle of water. When he approached the grate, the dog slowly lifted his head, recognized him, but didn't move. He only looked at him with those eyes that spoke 1,000 words, eyes that asked for nothing but begged for everything. "It's okay, little guy, I won't hurt you," Frank said in a low voice, extending his hand with the sandwich. The dog didn't eat. He only sniffed, trembling slightly. Frank gently placed the food and water down in the patch of dry dirt where the animal was tied. He observed the surroundings. There was no visible house, just the old fence and what looked like an abandoned backyard. The rope was secured to a rusted pipe, hammered into the wall like part of something forgotten. That's when he understood. This dog wasn't a stray. Someone had left him here. Someone tied him up. Someone knew he was here and still did nothing. Blood rushed to Frank's face, and he clenched his fists. And as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Frank walked back to his house, grabbed the old flip phone he rarely used, and dialed a number. Police. Good afternoon. Look, I don't know if this counts as an emergency, but there's a dog. He swallowed hard. There's a little dog suffering. He's alone, tied up, and he's fading away. On the other end, they replied with that cold, automatic voice. Exact address, sir. End of Magnolia Street, near the house with the broken fence. The one that looks abandoned. Is he in immediate danger? Frank hesitated. Danger? Look, I don't know, but if he stays there, he's going to die. He hung up. Hours passed. Nothing. He went back in the afternoon. The sandwich was still there, untouched. The water knocked over. The dog was the same. Not a single sign of life around him. Frank knocked on the walls. He shouted, "Is anyone here? Is this dog yours? Hello!" Silence. It was then he knew. Abandonment doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it just stays quiet. And that dog had been in silence for so long that almost no one could hear him anymore. But Frank could, and from that moment on, he wasn't going to be quiet either. That night, Frank didn't return alone. He had spent the afternoon talking to two neighbors on his block. Mrs. Dolores, a kind lady who ran a small catering service and always knew everything, and Clara, a young woman who lived next door to the abandoned house. Neither of them knew there was a dog there. Seriously, Clara asked, her eyebrow raised. I walk by there all the time and never heard a thing. He doesn't bark, Frank said. He only cries. That single sentence changed everything. Clara went with him to the alley. When she peeked through the crack, she covered her mouth with both hands. My God, she murmured. How long has he been like this? I don't know, but we can't ignore him anymore. That night, for the first time, the dog's silence became a collective sound. Clara brought a blanket. Mrs. Dolores arrived with a plate of chicken and rice. Frank carried a flashlight. They aimed the light. They approached carefully, as if they were standing before something both sacred and broken. And there he was, in the same corner, pressed against the wall with his head down. But when he felt their presence, he lifted his gaze for just a second. And in that second, everything changed. There was something in those eyes. It wasn't just sadness. It was a mix of confusion, exhaustion, and something more. A tiny, almost extinguished spark, but alive. We're going to get you out of here, little one, Clara said in a gentle voice. The dog tried to stand. His skinny legs trembled. He couldn't manage more than a few inches before collapsing again. He can't take any more, exclaimed Mrs. Dolores, her eyes filling with tears. This is a crime, Frank stated firmly. And suddenly, the story wasn't just his and the dog's. Now, it belonged to the whole neighborhood. The next day, 5 people stood on the street in front of a wall. The rope was still there. The dog was, too. A woman brought a bucket of fresh water. A boy left a piece of a granola bar wrapped in foil. A younger man asked if they had called animal control yet. Yes, but no one came, Frank said, frustrated. Then we have to put pressure on them. Someone uploaded a photo to Facebook. Another neighbor posted a video on TikTok. The comments started pouring in. Some neighbors began calling the police non-emergency line. Others called a local rescue group. Meanwhile, the dog still didn't understand anything. He just watched, wiggling his tail slightly, as if his body was asking if something truly different was happening. And then the unimaginable happened. He cried, but not that muffled sob from days before. This time, it was a clear, sharp, almost human whimper. A sound that brought tears to Mrs. Dolores's eyes. A sound that made Frank grit his teeth and swear under his breath, I promise you, we won't fail you this time. Because that cry was no longer alone. That cry finally had an echo. The next morning was different. The alley was no longer a forgotten corner. Now there was movement, hushed talking, people driving by slower than usual. Some stopped, others pretended not to look, but everyone knew, somehow. Clara, her eyes red from a sleepless night, stood by the fence early on. Mrs. Dolores arrived with a half-full basket of pastries and sat on a small stool. Frank had his cane in one hand and a notepad in the other. "If they don't come today, I'm going down to City Hall," he said, writing something with a shaky hand. "We're not going to let this be forgotten." Around 10 a.m., 2 volunteers from a small local rescue association arrived. One was named Marcus. The other was a tall young woman with a serious face named Tara. They came equipped with gloves, a crate, and a determined look. "Where is he?" Tara asked the moment she stepped out of the car. Frank led them to the wall. Marcus peered through the crack. Silence. The dog was still there, thinner than yesterday, quieter. But when he heard the footsteps, he lifted his head, and something in his eyes changed. It was as if his body finally recognized an opportunity. Tara knelt down in front of the wall and spoke softly. "Hi there, little fella. We're here now." "Yes, we are." The dog tilted his head. He didn't move further. Not a growl, not a whimper. Just that look. The one that says, "Is this really true?" But when they tried to open the small gate to enter the yard, they ran into a problem. The door was secured with a thick, rusty padlock. "Damn it," Marcus muttered. "Who puts a dog back here and locks him in?" "Someone without a soul," Clara said with contained fury. "We have to open this now. What if the owner shows up?" A nervous neighbor asked. "Let him," Frank replied. "I have a few things to say to him." Tara called the police. This time was different. The case had been reported 2 days ago. There were photos, videos, witnesses, and most importantly, there was indignation. The neighbors started gathering. Some only watched. Others brought water, food, blankets. "This is animal cruelty," a woman said through sobs. "This is abandonment," another replied. "This is inhumane," Frank added. And then, something unexpected happened. The side door of the house creaked open. Out stepped a disheveled man with a ripped shirt, a tired face, and vacant eyes. The silence became absolute. The man looked at the dog, looked at the crowd, and said nothing. Tara confronted him. "Is this your dog?" He didn't answer. "How long have you not fed him?" she insisted. He dropped his head. Frank took a step forward. "What kind of person leaves a living creature to die? Like he was a rock?" The man just mumbled. "I didn't know what to do with him. Leaving him to cry was not an option," Clara yelled, her eyes blazing with anger. Tara approached the padlock and forced it open with a tool. There was a click, and the metal yielded. They went in. There, for the first time in days, someone touched the little dog. Tara knelt, stroking his head with a softness that seemed otherworldly. The dog closed his eyes, not out of fear, but relief. Marcus wrapped his frail body in a blanket. The animal didn't resist. He simply allowed himself to be carried. And in that moment, when they carried him through the gateway and onto the street, people applauded. They applauded as if celebrating a victory, as if the world, for a second, had returned to make sense. And the dog, for the first time in God knows how long, moved his tail. Marcus and Tara carried the little dog with all the care in the world. He seemed like a paper creature, light, trembling, as if the wind could blow him away. Yet, he was still there, breathing, living, feeling everything. "Come on, champ, the worst is over," Marcus murmured as he settled him into the back seat of the rescue van. Frank approached and, his voice low, said, "Take him somewhere they call him by a name." Because here, he didn't even have that. Tara looked at him with tenderness. "And what would you name him?" Frank hesitated for a second, but then smiled. "Valor," he said, "because only a valiant heart survives so much pain." Tara nodded. "Perfect. From today, he is Valor." The van pulled away slowly amidst applause, tears, and a silence that weighed like lead. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence full of respect. A silence that said, "You did it." Meanwhile, at the house, the owner watched from the sidewalk, unmoving, saying nothing. Clara shot him a hard look. You didn't deserve his glance. But he loved you anyway. Mrs. Dolores looked sideways. And that's what hurts the most. That dogs love even those who forget them. The man didn't respond. And truthfully, it no longer mattered, because that story wasn't his anymore. It was the story of a dog who cried in silence until someone finally saw him. Valor was welcomed by a gray-haired, gentle-handed volunteer named Maria. She wrapped him in another blanket, cleaned his paws caked with hard dirt, and offered him a little water. At first, he only sniffed it, then he drank. He drank like he hadn't had a sip in weeks. "Good boy," Maria whispered. They examined his body. He had old wounds, scabs, irritated skin, ticks, and was dangerously underweight. But the most noticeable thing was his eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on everyone, as if trying to figure out if he could trust them yet, if this was real. Every time someone approached, he tilted his head as if asking, "Is this love, or is it another trap?" They gave him a dog bed. He didn't use it at first, remaining curled up in a corner, watching. But that night, when everything was quiet, Valor did something that broke the hearts of everyone present. He slowly crawled onto the blanket, sniffed it, and sighed. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a cry. It was a deep, settling sigh, like someone finally letting down their guard. And just like that, he fell asleep in peace for the first time. 3 days passed. At the shelter, Valor continued to recover. He ate little, slept a lot, but every morning, he moved his tail a little bit more. And for all the volunteers, that was like watching a flower open after a storm. Meanwhile, something curious was happening in the neighborhood. They were no longer talking about the grocery prices or the upcoming football game. They were talking about him, the little dog who cried alone, the one who almost died, the one now named Valor. "Did you hear about the dog?" the teens asked at the local park. "They say he survived," the older women replied in line at the bakery. "My daughter wants to go visit him," commented Mr. Tom, the taxi driver. "She says she's never wanted to hug someone she doesn't know so much." And he wasn't the only one. Clara, along with other neighbors, organized a collection. They gathered blankets, kibble, old toys, bowls, and even donated some cash. Frank brought a handwritten note. "For you, Valor. I didn't know you, but I saw you, and that changed my life. Thank you for reminding me that true love sometimes has 4 paws and a look that never gives up." Even the girl in apartment 2B, who was always afraid of dogs, drew a picture of Valor lying on a cloud. The shelter volunteers couldn't believe it. "All this for one dog?" Maria asked with a smile. "Yes," Tara said, "because this dog gave a soul back to an entire block." One morning, there was a knock on the shelter door. It was Frank. He wore a neatly pressed shirt, his cane freshly polished, and a bag of dog biscuits. "Can I see him?" he asked, like someone asking permission to visit a grandchild. Maria guided him to the recovery area. Valor was lying down, half asleep, but feeling familiar footsteps. He lifted his head, sniffed the air, and then got up. He walked slowly, still wobbly, to the gate. Frank knelt in front of him. "You remember me, little buddy?" Valor moved his tail, not strongly, not happily. He moved it with recognition, like one who says, "You were the first." And then, without much thought, Valor did something no one expected. He leaned his head against Frank's leg. It wasn't an automatic movement. It was a conscious gesture, a silent hug. And Frank, who hadn't cried in years, let the tears fall. He didn't say anything. He just stroked his head while repeating softly, thank you for not giving up." The days passed. Valor was walking more steadily now. He was still thin, of course, but he no longer looked like he would snap in the wind. His eyes shone brighter. Every so often, he'd let out a soft bark, as if he was testing how to use his voice again. And that voice was no longer pain. It was soft, brief, but it was life. The video of his rescue, filmed by one of the neighbors, began to circulate online. Within days, thousands of people watched it, shared it, and cried with him. Comments arrived from New York, California, even from Americans living abroad. "Thank you for not giving up on him. This reminded me of my rescue dog from years ago. I can't adopt, but I want to help. Donations arrived, letters arrived, drawings from elementary school kids arrived with hearts, paw prints, and phrases like, "Valor, you are strong." But not everything was digital. In the neighborhood, Valor's story had awakened something deeper: shared responsibility. People who never spoke to each other began to nod hellos. A small neighborhood animal support group was formed. Even a sign posted at the entrance to the park read, "If you see a pet suffering, don't look away. Do like Mr. Frank, do something." Frank, in turn, became a kind of quiet hero. Every afternoon, he stopped by the shelter, sometimes with a slice of salami, other times with a clean blanket. Valor was waiting for him. It was their time. Frank would sit on the garden bench, and Valor would lie down at his feet. Neither spoke, but they said everything. One afternoon, Maria said out loud, "What if Valor stayed with you?" Frank blinked. He was silent for a few seconds. "With me? Yes. He recognizes you. He looks for you. He waits for you. He loves you." Frank lowered his gaze. "I haven't had anyone home in years. I thought that silence was normal, that it was just part of life now. And now I realize it wasn't silence. It was loneliness." Valor looked at him with the noblest eyes in the world, and then Frank, his eyes moist, let out, "If he wants to, I want to, too." Maria smiled. "Well, I think he chose you a long time ago." That same week, the adoption was made official. Frank arrived at the shelter with a bag of his favorite kibble, a bag of treats, 2 new toys, and a brand new dog bed. Valor walked out next to him, not running, not jumping, but walking with a slow, sure step, like one who knows he's no longer fleeing, but returning. When they crossed the shelter gate, the sky was covered in golden hues. It was sunset, and as they walked down the street toward home, people watched them. Some applauded, others cried. Some children shouted from a distance, "Goodbye, Valor. You earned it." Frank looked down at him. "Yes, you earned it, champion. You earned the right to believe again." And Valor just moved his tail, not with force, not with anxiety, but with that deep calm of one who finally knows he is home. Valor's first night in his new home was different. Frank had prepared everything: the bed next to the window, 2 new bowls, and a cushion that said, "Home Sweet Home," that he found at a garage sale that morning. Valor entered the house slowly. First, he sniffed every corner. Then he looked at the ceiling as if he couldn't believe there were now walls protecting him. He stopped near a chair and stood still. Frank knelt down with effort. "You can move around, little guy. There are no ropes here anymore." Valor looked at him as if he understood every word. He took 2 steps and then lay down. Not on the bed, not on the cushion. He lay down at Frank's feet, right where his heart already felt safe. As the days turned into weeks, the routine became more beautiful than Frank had ever imagined. In the morning, they had coffee on the porch. Frank with his mug, Valor with his gaze fixed on the birds on the wires. At noon, they walked to the park. Not far, just a loop, but every step was a celebration. "Look who's here," the neighborhood kids would shout. "It's good old Valor." The dog only watched at first, but one day, he wagged his tail. Then he allowed himself to be petted, and eventually, he barked. Yes, he barked. It wasn't a bark of fear. It was an "I'm here." And everyone celebrated as if it were Christmas. Before, Frank's house was silent. Now, it had a rhythm. Before, he ate leftovers. Now, he cooked chicken and rice and sometimes even added vegetables to share with Valor. Before, no one knocked on his door. Now, the doorbell occasionally rang. "Mr. Frank, can Valor come out to play?" And he, feigning annoyance, would say, "Well, only for a little bit. You hear?" Inside, he couldn't have been happier. The silence that once surrounded him no longer hurt. Now it was a shared silence, one filled with glances, paws on the floor, quiet sighs, and that warmth only animals can give without asking for anything in return. One day, a letter arrived in the shelter's mailbox. It was addressed to Frank. It read, "Thank you. I don't know who you are, but I know you did something few would do. You listened to a cry that others ignored. And you didn't just save a dog. You reminded us all what really matters. That a life is worth it. That every look, every tail that wags, is a story worth telling. And you, sir, you told it with love. It had no signature, but Frank didn't need one. He just smiled, folded the letter, and tucked it into his nightstand drawer next to photos of his wife. And that night, as Valor slept beside him, gently pawing at the rug, Frank whispered, I promise you, this story isn't going to end here. The days turned into weeks, and Valor was no longer just the crying dog. Now he was the neighborhood dog, everyone's friend, and, for many, a symbol. On the block, kids drew pictures of him. Adults greeted him by name. Even the stray dogs seemed to respect him, as if they knew he came from a deeper place of pain. But the one who changed the most was Frank. He no longer walked hunched over. He no longer spoke softly. Now he cracked jokes, stayed out on the porch longer. People heard him laugh. He even let his beard grow out a little, because Valor looks at me with pride and doesn't judge me. One afternoon, Tara from the shelter called Frank. Mr. Frank, would you be willing to bring Valor to an activity with children? Children? Yes, at a school. We want to tell his story. Many of these kids haven't had contact with animals, and we think he could teach them something very special. Frank paused, thinking. He looked at Valor, who was sleeping with his tongue out, happy and confident. If he wants to, I'll take him. And so it was. The visit was to an inner-city elementary school classroom, full of curious, shy, and bright faces. Some kids were scared, others wouldn't stop asking questions, but when Valor walked in, a magical silence fell. He went slowly, sniffing the air, gently wagging his tail. His scar on his paw was still there, but it no longer hurt. It was a badge of honor. Maria told the story carefully. With love, she spoke of the rope, the crying, the rescue, and the rebirth. And now, she said at the end, Valor is here to teach you that every living being deserves love, even when the world has forgotten them. A little boy stood up, said nothing. He walked over to Valor and sat down next to him. Valor looked at him, walked closer, and rested his head on the boy's leg, just as he had done with Frank. And the boy cried, not from sadness, but from relief. After that visit, Valor became a kind of canine therapist for the area. He went to schools, he went to homes where children were afraid, he visited seniors, and he always did the same thing. He didn't bark, he didn't jump, he didn't ask for anything. He just sat, looked with tenderness, and let his presence do the rest. Clara once said aloud, "This dog is healing everyone without saying a single word." And Frank, hearing her, thought, "He healed me first." Time passed, neither fast nor slow. It passed as it should when you live with a full heart. Valor was no longer that trembling, quiet little dog. He was strong, though still lean. He was happy, though he didn't make a fuss. He was light, though he was born in the shadow. That Sunday, like many others, Frank and Valor went for a walk. The sun was soft through the trees. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and damp earth. Everything seemed normal, but it wasn't. That day, Frank felt something different. Valor wasn't walking with the same energy. He was slow, slower than usual. "Are you tired, buddy?" Frank asked gently. Valor looked at him, just that, and continued walking with his short step, his quiet breathing, and his profound gaze. When they reached the park, Valor didn't run. He just lay down under his favorite tree, the one where they used to sit and watch life go by. Frank sat down next to him. Neither spoke. They just shared that silence full of meaning, that silence that used to hurt, but now healed. That night, Valor ate his dinner as always, drank water, and lay down in his bed. Frank stroked his head. "Good night, Valor. I love you very much. Did you know that?" Valor looked up, moved his tail just once, and closed his eyes. And he slept, but this time, he slept deeply, so deeply that he did not wake up again. The next morning was different. Frank got up as always, but the silence felt unfamiliar. It wasn't cold. It wasn't empty. It was the silence of farewell. He walked to the bed. Valor lay peacefully with the same expression of calm he'd had the first time he slept without fear. Frank didn't cry instantly. He just sat beside him and said, "Thank you for teaching me to live again." And then, yes, he cried. He cried as only you cry when you have loved truly. When the news got out, the neighborhood paused. The school held a moment of silence. Neighbors left flowers on Frank's doorstep. Children hung drawings of Valor on the park fence. Mrs. Dolores organized a small memorial. He wasn't just a dog, he was a teacher. And he came to remind us that there's still hope, even when everything seems lost. Frank, in honor of Valor, started a small group, Wagging Tail, Loving Heart. Every week, along with Clara, Maria, and other neighbors, they toured abandoned areas, rescued, fed, and loved. And in every sad look they found, they saw Valor, because he hadn't left. Not entirely. Valor was in the laughter of the children, in the firm voice of those who no longer stay silent, in the steps of those who choose to act, in every soul that learned to love animals again because of him. Valor was no longer crying. Now his story spoke for thousands. Months passed, and although Valor no longer walked the streets, his story traveled everywhere. The Wagging Tail, Loving Heart group grew. It started as a local effort, but now it had volunteers in other towns, in other states. They even received a message from a community in rural Texas that wanted to replicate the project. It all started with a dog who just cried, Clara would say at every presentation they gave. And though tears still appeared in every narration, they were different tears. They were no longer of sadness, they were of gratitude. In the park where Valor used to lie under his favorite tree, the neighborhood did something beautiful. Together, they raised money to place a small stone plaque that read, "Here rested the bravest heart. Valor, the dog who awakened our soul." Every so often, someone would leave a flower, a treat, a child, a thought, an adult. Even Frank went every week, sat next to the plaque, and quietly told it what he had done that week. "I'll tell you, we adopted another little dog, but this one still chews my slippers. He's not you, but he's got your eyes." And he would laugh with sadness. Yes, but also with that peace that only true love can give. One day, a local reporter approached Frank. "You're the one with the dog? The one who hurt him?" "Yes," he replied. "Can we tell your story?" He thought for a moment. Then he said, "Tell it, but not as mine. Tell it as everyone's. Because Valor wasn't just mine. He belonged to the neighborhood. He belonged to everyone who shared their food, their blanket, their time. He belonged to the children, the elderly, to those who still believe that an act of love can change everything." The story was published and shared thousands of times, not for the sadness, not for the scandal, but for the beauty in the simple, for the idea that listening to a cry can be the beginning of something that saves many lives. One day, as Frank walked with his new dog, a small mutt he had rescued from a highway rest stop, a boy approached him. "Is that Valor?" Frank knelt down, smiled, and replied, "No, son. Valor isn't here anymore. But if you close your eyes for a moment and listen carefully, maybe you can feel him close to your heart." The boy did just that. He closed his eyes and for a second swore he heard a tail wagging among the leaves. And he smiled. Valor didn't need words, or signs, or awards. He just needed to be seen, to be heard, and finally, to be loved. Sometimes, life doesn't scream. Sometimes, it just cries softly. It cries from a dirty corner, behind an old grate, or from the eyes of someone who no longer expects anything. And if you don't fine-tune your soul, you won't hear it. Valor was that cry, a sigh disguised as a bark, a hope that clung to life just because something inside him refused to give up. And he was seen, not by everyone, but by just one. One who listened when no one else wanted to hear. And that was enough, because sometimes a single glance can change everything. It was a story of transformation, of a dog who didn't know love, of a man who had stopped expecting it, of a neighborhood that lived asleep, and of how a single broken heart can touch thousands. Valor didn't become famous for barking loudly, or running fast, or knowing tricks. He became eternal because he taught us to love unconditionally, to see where no one else sees, and to act when it's easier to stay silent. I want you to remember something. There might be a dog out there like Valor. They might be crying softly. Their rope might not be made of rope, but of indifference. You might have them close, or you might find them in a video, on the sidewalk, or at the back of an alley. When that happens, don't look away. Do like Mr. Frank. Do like Clara, Maria, Mrs. Dolores, the kids on the block. Do something, because even if it seems small, for that living being, it could be everything. This story doesn't end, because as long as there is someone who tells it, someone who listens, as long as there is one heart that beats stronger remembering Valor, he is still here. In every rescue, in every hug, in every tale that wags with fear and hope. Thank you, Valor, for showing us that even a broken soul can teach the world to love better. And here we reach the end of this story, folks. A story that, if it touched your heart even a little, was worth telling. If this story touched your heart, just imagine how many more we still have to share. Subscribe to Whisker Tales, hit the bell icon, and join us for every new episode of courage, loyalty, and second chances. Because every life deserves to be remembered,